Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for sharing your lunchtime with us. I'm Chad Washburn, Vice President of Conservation at Naples Botanical Garden here in Naples, Florida. And I want to welcome everyone today. Y una bienvenida especial a mis amigos de Cuba, Puerto Rico y Haiti que nos acompañan hoy. So, before we start, I'd just like to note that your interest and advocacy for native plants is vital to sustainable life here in Florida. As members of the Florida Native Plant Society, we often work to promote native plants for their role in an ecosystem related to pollinators and other wildlife, especially when we use them in a created landscape. But in today's presentation, we'll cover some other ecosystem functions that we don't often always consider in our conversations around native plants. So I encourage and challenge you to look at native plants in the landscape from this perspective today. So today we're going to focus on stormwater ponds. Collier County, the county in which I live and where Naples, Florida is located, alone we've got over 8,200 stormwater ponds. And that represents a significant opportunity to use the function of native plants to help clean our water. I see that as 8,200 opportunities in my community alone to promote native plants, provide habitat for wildlife, and significantly impact water quality in the Gulf Coast. So first, I want to start out by let's define a stormwater pond's littoral zone. This is the transitional area between the upland and open water around a stormwater pond. And for the purposes of this program, we'll be talking about the native plantings in this area, and we're going to include the upland buffer side of plantings around the lakes. So we can break the littoral zone down into three different areas. We have the emergent zone. Let me bring up a pointer. The emergent zone, and these are plants growing rooted in water, and they can range from inundated to flooded, depending on fluctuating water levels throughout the year. Then the transitional zone, and these are plants that are growing rooted in water or above the water line, and it really depends on fluctuation of water levels. And then the upland buffer, and these are plants that are outside of that littoral zone, but they perform a really important ecological function. And we'll talk about that throughout my presentation today. So first, let's take a brief look at the different functions and values of littoral plantings and why these are important to the overall health and efficiency of a stormwater system. Remember, nearly all of the stormwater ponds in our communities were designed to function to remove pollutants from water before it reaches our lakes, rivers, bays, and the Gulf. And a majority of that function required to become a sink for pollutants rather than a source happens in that littoral edge where those native plants live. So let's look closer at some of these functions provided by the littoral ecosystem. This is where we'll go beyond the typical idea that littoral buffers just act to uptake pollutants. They also provide food and habitat, essential food and habitat for fish and wildlife. They improve the aesthetics of our communities and can actually work to increase property values, control erosion and stabilize our shorelines, act as a buffer between the uplands and open water, remove, prevent, and sequester pollutants. So we'll go a little bit more into depth on each of these points. So littorals, especially the emergent native plants, provide habitat for aquatic invertebrates and small fish. That contributes to healthy fish populations, which going up the food chains provides food for wading birds. In fact, the littoral areas at the Botanical Gardens in Naples are one of the best places to see birds. And our birding tour actually begins outside of the Botanical Garden, and it starts in our parking lot of all places. But we have native planted bioswales as part of our stormwater system, and that area is actually a birding hotspot. And we usually see 15 to 20 species in the parking lot bioswales before we even get into the garden. Littoral plantings can drastically alter the look of a stormwater pond and increase property values, especially in a situation like this one. So I took this picture last month, and here in the southern part of the state, my experiences here in Collier County, so I'll share my experiences. But across much of the state, many of our stormwater ponds look like this before the rains begin in earnest. I call this ring around the tub. And in many cases, Littoral plants can be used to help hide the banks in low water level situations. This one has quite a bit of water loss, so it could be a challenge, but they do help to hide this ring around the tub. In a pond like this, one of the things that exacerbates the problem of water loss is a fountain. These fountains spraying water into the air lead to increased evaporation, and that can lower the water levels in the pond. Littoral plants, native littoral plants, can help to control erosion and stabilize the shorelines. And we see this in many of our ponds where the shoreline isn't stable and sloughs off into the pond. And I'm sure many of you have seen this in your communities. This is often a consideration where grass carp are used in ponds to control algae, where plants can't grow. When some of the fish nest along the edges, we get the banks will slough off. Native littoral plants can both help by holding the soil in place and by buffering wave action within the pond that can add to erosion problems. We often think of erosion as something that comes downhill, but in a stormwater pond, um, even with wind and small waves, 1 or 2 inch waves, you get a little bit of erosion along the banks. So native littoral plants can help with this. This picture, this is in my own community. So both littoral plants and that upland buffer can act as a kind of barrier between the uplands and the open water. And this is what many of our ponds across Florida look like, turf right down to the water's edge. A native littoral planting and a buffer planting on the upland side of that can prevent grass clippings and leaf litter from going into a pond. Grass clippings and other organic matter from leaf litter are a major pollutant in our ponds, and they can contribute significantly to algal blooms and management issues. That happens because organic matter in the water column, we get a bunch of grass or leaves blown into the pond. Those decompose. And when they decompose, they reduce oxygen levels in the pond. Um, Low oxygen in a pond in water causes sediments or causes pollutants that are bound to the sediments. Remember, these ponds are designed to trap pollutants. When we get low oxygen in the water column, a lot of those pollutants can be released from the sediments, especially phosphorus. And it's released into the water column, and phosphorus can cause algal blooms. Littoral plantings and upland plantings also act as a buffer between what goes on onto our lawns and the water. So we know that most lawns across the state are fertilized, and both nitrogen and phosphorus are significant pollutants in our water. For this presentation, I want to touch a little bit on phosphorus because it is one of the greatest pollutants in our freshwater systems. And nitrogen can be more of a pollutant in our brackish and coastal our waterways. So Florida soils often naturally contain phosphorus. It's a part of our soils. So for this presentation, I want to focus solely on anthropogenic phosphorus, or phosphorus that as humans we input into the system. That's typically through fertilizers on our lawns and our trees and on our landscape. Phosphorus is the major limiting nutrient in freshwater systems, and it can cause significant damage to the health and function of a stormwater pond. And it really doesn't take much phosphorus in the water column to significantly alter the growth of algae in a body of fresh water. Just a little bit of phosphorus causes an algal bloom. So in this chart, we've got the difference between oligotrophic and eutrophic. To just define that, an oligotrophic pond, oligotrophic, would be relatively low in nutrients and have an abundance of dissolved oxygen throughout the water column. Eutrophic, a eutrophic pond is rich in nutrients, supports a dense population of plants and quite often algal blooms. And the decomposition of all of that removes oxygen from the water column. To think about that, an oligotrophic would be something you could see very deep into the water column, and the eutrophic one would be bright green and algal blooms throughout the year. The difference between those two systems, an oligotrophic lake is about 0.05 parts per million total phosphorus. A eutrophic lake is about 0.01 parts per million total phosphorus. That is not much difference in phosphorus that can cause a lake to go from clear and really good water quality to algal blooms throughout the year. So I'm a visual person, and I need to see this in a more visual way. And unfortunately, we know this. So the 1970s were a very different time. This is on the upper portion of the screen. This would be an oligotrophic body of water, and on the south, this is eutrophic. This is a photo from a project called the Experimental Lakes Area, and this is near Ontario, Canada. And there were hundreds of lakes, and they used them experimentally throughout the 70s to identify and study what different pollutants and different management activities had on water. And this study really identified phosphorus as a limiting nutrient and algal growth in freshwater systems. And they actually have a curtain in this pond that prevents water from going back and forth. And they put fertilizer, phosphorus, in one side of this, and it caused algal blooms. Was devastating to the water quality of this lake. So, as a scientist, yeah, I saw this picture and I wanted to know, I wanted to see this myself firsthand. I wanted to recreate this in my own lake, but without changing the water quality, without putting phosphorus into the lake. So, I grabbed a pitcher and did one mixed sample, and I poured some of that water into each of these two glass vials. And in one of these, I put just a couple crystals of liquid fertilizer that dissolve into liquid fertilizer. I wanted to see what happens. And you can guess what a couple sand grains, you can guess which one of those I put the fertilizer into. That was this one. So it really does not take much phosphorus for a lake to go from good water quality to one that has algal growth and algal blooms. So just a few other ways that native littoral and buffer plantings can impact impact nutrient, pollutant, and sedimentation in stormwater systems. Um, and not just our ponds, but they act to slow the flow of water in conveyances and ditches. In designed and planted, if ditches and waterways are designed with plantings, they can help slow the water, and that causes settling of sediments and pollutants. Littoral plantings often also, and I mentioned this earlier, they dampen wave energy within a pond, and that prevents erosion and resuspension of the sediments into the water column. And then there's that other thing that is the thing that we usually talk about. It's usually about the only thing we talk about when we talk about native plants and stormwater systems. And that's that they help to uptake pollutants and especially nutrients within the pond. So we know that a healthy, established native littoral ecosystem around a pond um, is beneficial to water quality and beneficial to the environment, beneficial to fish and birds and on up the food chain. But I want to talk about some of the recommendations. You want to do this in your own community. Where do you start? What are some of the things that you need to do to start? Um, First, um, and all of this is adapted from a 2-day class that we offer, Botanical Garden offers in collaboration with Rookery Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve and Collier County Pollution Control. And we offer this several times throughout the year. So if this presentation piques your interest, please see about joining that 2-day class to learn more about this. I'm just going to do an overview. So first, treat the area as an ecosystem. Promote healthy ecosystem function. Use only native plants. That function is vital to clean water across Florida. Non-native aquatic plants can also often become invasive or spread throughout the bodies of water. So focus on native plants and create an ecosystem. Secondly, recommendation, collaborate with your community and landscape managers. Collaboration is key. So collaborate in the design, the planting, the management. Quite often, your community landscape is managed by either individual homeowners or one business, and water, the ponds are managed by another business. Bring everybody together in the same room before you start having conversations about planting littoral plants and managing your stormwater system as an ecosystem. That broad support is key to success. Know your pond's seasonal changes. Know the key factors about each pond in your community. If you have several ponds, they'll fluctuate differently in water levels. If you live closer to the coast, some of them are going to be more saline throughout the year, or more brackish throughout the year than others. Each pond has its own parameters and should be planted and maintained and managed individually. Next, select appropriate plants. Select the plants based on the areas that you're planting, the salinity of the water, maximize long-term performance over dormancy. And I'll focus on that in a bit towards the end. A lot of our native plants tend to go dormant during portions of the year. And again, plant only natives and avoid non-native plants. When is the best time to plant? Plant at the beginning of the rainy season, or as the water levels are coming up, or when the water levels are high, as opposed to when the water levels are going down. You want to have that water will help to support the growth of those plants. Plant those plants on the higher side and allow them to grow in. They will, if you plant them higher so that their roots are in water, even if it's an aquatic plant, remember it's coming out of a nursery where it's likely grown from irrigation and not in deep water. So if you plant something that's coming out of a nursery into deep water, you may end up drowning that plant. So plant it on the high side, and they will grow into. They will find where their best location in that pond. Start with a small area, manage that adaptively, and build on success. We've seen a few communities come in and plant native littorals on several square miles or several linear miles in their community. Start small, see what works best. If you have success with those areas, build on those successes. If you have one big failure like that, if you plant an entire area several miles and parts of that fail, it's hard to get support to invest in fixing those areas. Design with a buffer that does not block views, but is wide enough to keep green waste, clippings, and fertilizer out of the water. So don't just plant a littoral zone, plant an upland buffer on that to keep those materials out of your pond. This is a big one we hear from homeowners. Plant to keep key view sheds open. Don't block views of lakes from residents. A lot of residents, they want to be able to see the water, and they're concerned that if we plant those areas, they won't be able to see the water. However, because of the slope and because of if you plant the right plants that are not tall enough, you won't block those views, and you can actually enhance the shoreline. And lastly, I would recommend avoiding grass carp in stormwater areas. They can, if you do have them in your ponds, if you plant native plants, they will consume the plants. They can significantly limit your ability to establish littoral plants. So just at Naples Botanical Garden, when we planted the garden, we wanted to really have water as a key story throughout the garden. So we included stormwater throughout the entire garden. And I'll go over some of those areas to show you. And these are all planted as ecosystems. They're planted with native plants. They're planted with the idea of using native plants and their ecosystem function to clean water and act as habitat. So a drop of water, just to tell a story of a drop of water that falls on our largest impervious surface, that's our parking lot. It flows across the parking lot, often picking up pollutants, and into these bioswales. These bioswales are planted with native plants. The plants that are there are selected from native Florida ecosystems that are dry throughout the dry season of the year, and that get inundation throughout the wet season. We don't irrigate these plants. So throughout the year, we don't fertilize them. We don't do anything other than manage weeds. So water immediately goes into these bioswales. And most of it from there recharges into the ground. It seeps into the ground. But if we get a large enough storm, it goes into a grate and out of this into the next part of the system. I will say that our bioswales at the garden are such an important part of our system. We just had a documentary that was done on them, and it'll be available internationally fairly soon. I can't talk about it too much until it's available. So from these bioswales, when they fill up, water goes into a drain, and then they're piped into the wetland at the entry to the botanical garden. And when you pull into a botanical garden, you expect to see beauty and all of these rare plants, and all, you expect to see, plants are the focal point. So we put stormwater right up front. We wanted to show people that stormwater can be beautiful. If you go to a big box store anywhere around the state, quite often your stormwater areas are an area that is turf grass, and they mow that, and it's hidden in the back of the behind the stores, or it's quite often got a chain link fence around it. When that area is mown, that grass clipping goes into the stormwater system. So some of these stormwater systems can actually be sources of pollutants. Sometimes since they're turf grass, landscape managers can fertilize in them, even though they're not supposed to. Ours is something that's beautiful. We put it right up front. It's a feature, not a bug. I think Steve Jobs would say that as a joke, but we want them to be a feature. We want to make them something sexy. So pull into the garden and you see part of our stormwater system. When that fills up, it either goes into groundwater recharge, the plants uptake it, or it evaporates. When we do get enough water there, it flows through a drain into Harvey's Lake. This is our main irrigation system, but stormwater, as it flows through here, it has a long residence time. So we want that water to be treated as long as possible. So it's being treated in this lake for long periods of time, up to even as long as a year. When that overflows, it goes to the river of grass, which is the main viewshed or main access across the garden. This is a miniature river of grass. This is a miniature Everglades. The main axis, the entire garden is built around a miniature Everglades. And it functions as not only stormwater treatment, but it functions as an ecosystem. It's a backdrop to everything we do in the garden. But we've had bobcats come out of our natural areas over here in the middle of the day and walk past people and hide in the river of grass. Quite often you see birds hunting, or you see fish in this area in the garden. You'll see tadpoles. It's an ecosystem. So we're really quite proud to have this native ecosystem, created native ecosystem, is the main axis of the garden. From there, water flows out into our lakes. This is a created and dug lake system, and the entire thing has literal plants, native ecosystems around the edge. And then from there, eventually, when that fills, it goes out, into our natural areas. And this is a natural wetland out here. So we've used native plants throughout this, and we interpret this. This has become the most asked for tour in our botanical garden. We are a world-class tropical botanical garden, and people come to us and ask for this as the biggest tour that we offer. We've offered this to the Blue-Green Algae Task Force scientists. We've several of the Water Management District folks, and several local and regional politicians have asked to come to see this. So it is something that's becoming more important and something that's becoming more requested in our communities. So I really encourage you, after this presentation, to think about your stormwater ponds and how you could help to improve water quality in your community by including native plants in your stormwater systems. So finally, I want to take a very brief look at planting concepts using some of the recommended plants for South Florida. And if you're anything like me, I'm a geek for plant lists. I love getting plant lists, especially native plant lists. I love to go out and study those plants and learn more about them. But I want to focus less, since we have since you're all joining us from across the state, and we've got some colleagues from some of the Caribbean islands joining us. I want to look at these plants just to give you a start on the concepts for planting areas. We'll There's some planting concepts that I can describe using recommended plants for a South Florida palette. But when working with your community to plan your stormwater pond plantings, look towards local and regional resources for recommended plants that are specific to your area, that are native to your area. Remember, Native Plant Society, your local Native Plant Society chapter can be a great resource, and your local botanical garden or your master gardeners or extension agency. Those are all great places to start locally. So on the upland, we're going to start on the upland side and move into the emergent side. Start with plants that have great ecosystem function that we know that work well. Several of these are plants, native plants that are used in the landscape industry. And I really recommend starting with grasses. These are grasses that often grow in wet ecosystems, wet communities. So in South Florida, we use Fakahatchee grass, dwarf Fakahatchee grass, sand cordgrass, Spartina bakeri. All three of these are used as ornamental grasses. Plant these in masses as the buffer plantings. We say that because we know that these work well. They have great ecosystem function. And then you want to add some of your more ornamental things into that, but start with your function. Another great one that goes a little bit lower down the bank is marsh hay cordgrass or Spartina patens. It likes to have a little bit wetter feet. But we can't have all just function. We've got to have some beauty. We want to put some things in there that add some flowering to that. So what I like to do when I spec at the garden or in working with communities in our area, muhly grass, pink muhly grass, Muhlenbergia capillaris. This is a great grass. If you drive across 41 or Tamiami Trail, especially in the fall, when this is in bloom, it looks like the landscape is on fire. You see these beautiful pink blooms, especially sunset and sunrise. This performs really well. It's a solid performer. It's going to hold soil well. It's going to establish. It's going to help prevent weeds. But this one will reseed. Most of those four other grasses don't really reseed as much into the landscape. This one reseeds, and when it's not in bloom, it can look a little bit scraggly. So when I spec a landscape, put about 20% of this in mixed plantings throughout. So you'll get some beauty throughout the year, but you also have that solid function and that success. Another one that you can add, and this will go quite a ways up the bank. It can take, as long as it can get its roots down into some water, this one will grow well in South Florida. Golden leather fern, Acrosticum aureum. This one's a little more attractive. There's two native leather ferns, but this one I think is a little bit more attractive. It just has the fertile fronds at the tips, and those look brown and brown. A lot of people think those look dead. The other one gets fertile fronds all the way down. So this one can help break up some of that just look of grasses. Moving down into the water, and again, remember, I'm just focusing on the concepts and concepts using plants from the South region. Gulf Coast spikerush and knotted spikerush. These are two spikerushes that we use in the emergent portion of a planting. I like to plant both of them because we want more diversity. They are a little bit different in their growth needs, but ponds fluctuate throughout the year. Sometimes they could be more brackish, more fresh. Water levels go up and down as we want diversity. So these two, knotted spikerush and Gulf Coast spikerush, these are performers. So we would plant these in the water levels. So, but again, we can't just have all function. We want to add some beauty to that. So again, these will get great coverage They perform really well. That's what you want to go for to start with. And then you add in your things with beauty. So this next group of plants are emergent plants that I would use as accents. They provide some color and form through their leaves or through blooms. And for the greatest impact, plant things like this, regional plants in masses or clumps. You get some good impact. So duck potato, Sagittaria latifolia. This likes organic soils, but in many of our ponds, we've had muck buildup, so you'll have that organic soils. This can be a little bit more difficult to establish in a brand new pond. Lance leaf arrowhead, Sagittaria lancifolia. This is another great one to plant. Um, Again, plant these in masses, and you'll get areas. These get little white flowers, so you'll get this difference in leaf form, a little bit more of a tropical look. Another one that I really like for South Florida is swamp lily, Crinum americanum. This is one I would not plant in masses. This gets these beautiful white blooms, but I would spread them throughout the landscape in the edge of the water. We say that because the lubber grasshoppers feed on these, and when they're planted in masses, they get consumed fairly quickly. This is a great one. If you drive across Tamiami Trail or 41 again, when these are in bloom, you can see these just white clouds of flowers across the landscape, mixed in with grasses and rushes. So another great plant. Here in South Florida, Dixie iris, Iris hexagona. This is one that we include in a few areas around our littoral areas. It's not going to grow into a dense mat. The leaves kind of disappear throughout the year, but it's a great one to put, especially in front of homeowners. You'll get these beautiful purple flowers. Um, it blooms during in the spring, and that's typically here in South Florida when our snowbirds are here. Again, this likes a little bit more organic soils, but most of our older ponds have organic soils. Next concept is break up the shoreline a little bit. If we just have these plantings, when you look at the horizon, you just kind of have this line of grasses and rushes with that beauty, that ornamental aspect of native plants popping up through it. If you have an area that backs up to a, a golf course or a, um, a natural area, and you want to break up that vertical or that horizontal shoreline, um, then plant some of these trees. I wouldn't recommend planting them in front of homes because you don't want to block their view. But for some of those vertical elements here in South Florida, I like to use buttonwoods. These are used as street trees in several areas around the world, especially the green buttonwood. Here in South Florida, the silver buttonwood is used. Bald cypress. These, even though they go bald, like the name, during the winter months, they have a beautiful form to them. So this is one I would plant to help that they have that great architectural form in the branching. So this is one I would plant again along a natural area. And for us, another beautiful one is Dahoon holly. I like to include this one because it's got these beautiful red berries, but it also produces fruits for birds. This is used as a street tree, but really it likes wet feet in organic soils. So we've got concepts of, those are some of the concepts for planting these areas. And again, I recommend using native plants that are best for your area, that are native to your part of the state or your country for our colleagues who are joining us from around the Caribbean. Next, I want to focus on something that has bothered me um, throughout the years that I've worked in my region to bring native plants to stormwater ponds and my focus on clean water. These are plants that I see on nearly every list for native plants for stormwater. However, I would not include them, or I would include them very sparingly. Again, I say this because I've seen people plant nothing but these plants and have failure in their community, and then the community won't invest in the landscape, won't invest in stormwater plantings again. So these plants are pickerel weed. Uh, this is on nearly every single list that I see, but I avoid it or use it sparingly because it goes dormant most winter months. Here in South Florida, that's when all of the snowbirds are here. I've seen it dominate an area in the summer months and then die during the winter months when so many of our visitors are here, and then people complain. Pickerel weed is also highly location specific genetically. So it's genetically different across the state. Dr. Michael Kane did a great presentation at a Native Plant Society conference several years ago, and these bloom at different times. If you select one from Naples versus Tampa, they bloom at different times throughout the year. They have different leaf shapes, different flower forms. So this is a highly variable plant. Um, and so you're going to get different things based on what you get from different nurseries. Alligator flag, Thalia geniculata, and I realize this picture is either a different form or a different species. It's got the red petioles to it. But alligator flag is a beautiful plant, forms these dense colonies of these broadleafed, it's really tropical looking native plant. However, this has a tendency to go dormant, either with um, the light changing throughout the year, diurnal cycles, or water levels dropping. So again, you get this big mass of dead brown leaves throughout the winter months when quite a few of our visitors come down. People don't like to see that, so you get complaints, and then it's hard to promote aquatic plantings. And I see these on every plant list. Yellow canna, this is another great plant. However, it spreads in masses, and then you get people complain when it dies back when it goes dormant throughout the year. The last one that I see on a lot of plant lists, native plant lists, and again I recommend against it, is giant bulrush. This is now Xenoplectus, and there are a couple different species. It used to be Scirpus, but these get about 9 foot tall and they take over. So no homeowner wants something that's going to block their view. Again, I see these on plant lists. I recommend against them. So those are some of the concepts, again, for planting your own plants in your stormwater system. So with that, I just want to, one more thing. There are several other resources out there for stormwater ponds. Rookery Bay Research Reserve here in South Florida offers these incredible classes in collaboration with Naples Botanical Garden and Collier County Pollution Control. We offer this workshop. It's a 2-day online workshop, 2 4-hour workshops that we offer. We've offered this to community members. We've specialized it to homeowners associations and community association managers, community boards. We're working towards offering one for landscape architects for designing stormwater systems, to native nursery, to FNGLA. We hope to offer one to them. We've also offered it to lake and landscape managers so that they can better understand. Everybody's kind of got to be on the same page for this to work. So check Rookery Bay Research Reserve's website for more information on when these classes are offered. It goes into much more depth than I've gone into today. But again, the whole focus is using native plants as ecosystem function. So with that, I will stop there. We're at about 40 minutes, and we'll open everything up for questions. And Valerie, I'm not sure how this part works, so I think maybe you'll read questions to me. Okay. Yeah, I can hear your audio. Okay, I can hear Valerie's audio. So if we get questions, if anybody has any questions, I'd love to open it up. Is anybody trying to do this in your own community? If you are, what issues are you having? We want to make sure we address this in a way that, as we offer these educational classes. And remember, again, there's, what did I say, 3,000, 8,200 opportunities in my own community alone to get native plants out as ecosystems. So across the state, just think of how much opportunity each of us has to not only promote native plants outside of what we typically think of as native plantings, but also to promote water quality.
This is not a group that has a lot of questions so far.
Wow. Okay.
We do have 78 people on.
Wow. Oh, awesome. Well, welcome everybody. It's been quite amazing at the garden to see the picture that you can see on your screen. This is a stormwater pond that we dug in as part of our stormwater system at the garden. We dug this in 2008 and 2009. So all of these littoral plantings that you see here were established shortly after that. We worked with engineers, landscape architects, landscape managers, and myself as a restoration ecologist to design this in a way that uses native plants, but we get the greatest ecosystem function. And when you see this pond looks like it's about almost 2 miles of shoreline. It looks like it's been there for forever. It's a really well-established system, and again, it's one of the best places to see birds in the botanical garden.
We did get some questions come through.
All right,
So
we got
Deborah
some questions.
Deborah asked, "Is it okay to have occasional spread out trees along the banks, i.e., sweet gums, for shade for residents?"
Okay. Great question, Deborah, about having trees periodically along your littorals to offer shade. Yes, absolutely. Make sure, again, you plant regionally appropriate native trees that can take wet feet or growing in water. We don't get sweet gums as far south as I am in Collier County. There's a couple north of us in the northern part of the county, but we're towards the southern end of their range. But yes, absolutely. You can see in this image, we've got quite a horizontal shoreline. To break that up, one of my favorites to use is red maple. It's a great native plant. And when you have these long view sheds across the lake, if you plant them on this bank on the far side, you can see the reflection when those are bright red, it's a beautiful, beautiful image across the lake. So just make sure if you're planting trees in littoral areas that they like wet feet, they're native trees that like wet feet, and that they're ones that are not going to block a homeowner's view um, unless they want it blocked. You want to put them in places maybe between property or in more open areas. So great question. Thank you.
Jonathan asks, "There are cattails planted along the edge of the canal in my yard. I think they were planted to discourage alligators. Are they native? Desirable?"
Oh, good question. So that question was about cattails. Cattails are native to Florida. There are 3 species of cattails around the Americas. Those 3 species have hybridized, and we get what's called hybrid vigor. And because of that, cattails have become a nuisance species. They can very efficiently use nutrients, and they'll spread when we get nutrients in the system. They spread very rapidly. They like disturbance, and they'll take over areas. Plantings like this can discourage. We don't get alligators up on our banks because we have these broad plantings. We don't want alligators in our gardens. So they help discourage them from coming up into the garden. Um, Cattails, however, we manage against cattails. They're really hard to eradicate because the way you treat them, they continue to come back. They have these big starchy tubers. So we manage against cattails, and we manage for a greater diversity of native plants. We like diversity. It's more resilient. So we try and get manage against cattails and get more diverse plantings in. So cattails do provide function. They are helping to uptake nutrients, but again, we want more diversity. We want to offer more to wildlife. So good question.
Marlis I hope I'm not butchering your name, would like a copy of your recommended plants that you presented today.
Okay, I think we can. I'm not sure the best way to do that. Valerie, we can maybe she can share her email with you, and I can you can share it with me then, and we can do that.
Yeah, yeah. If you could
Okay.
email me at communications with an S at fnps.org. And also, this presentation will be available immediately after at the same link for anyone to rewatch. Anyone with the link.
And that's a question we get a lot when I do these presentations. And it's always interesting. I always hesitate to give out just a plant list because there's always so many questions then about, okay, I've got my plants. What's the next step? And then I always want to make sure that someone's using the appropriate plants. My plant list would not be appropriate for the panhandle. Definitely I talked about those concepts. Looked in, make sure that the native plants that you're planting are not going dormant during the winter months. Use plants that have that function. They're going to give you the best coverage and success, and then add your ornamental natives along with that. So.
Douglas would like to asks, what types of plants would you recommend for shadier wet locations?
Ooh, that's Um, one of the things that we try and do at the garden is not create dense shade areas because it can be difficult to get to establish some littorals in those areas. In areas of dense shade, um, that's a really good question. Here in South Florida, honestly, one of the best resources that I use here in South Florida for plants and for landscaping and for creating and restoring ecosystems is regionalconservation.org. So if you're south of Lake Okeechobee, I get on regionalconservation.org. They have a section called Natives for Your Neighborhood. And I look at plants by ecosystem. And I'll look at each ecosystem. And if it's like a wet ecosystem, like a marsh or a dune, and I use that to help pick out plants. So that's a tough question. I think it would really have to be by area, and I wouldn't recommend putting dense shade in.
Anne asks, do you do anything with rain gardens, and what is your experience?
Um, I have done some work across our region with rain gardens. Uh, I think rain gardens are fantastic. The more that we can do to slow water and get water in contact with native plants, the better, the cleaner our water is, and the greater ecosystem function that they have. Everything from providing food for wildlife, all of that. I recommend rain gardens. Check with your local um, county to see what the regulations are around rainwater gardens. I've seen small ones in people's yards that come off of their gutters. I think that's fantastic. The more that we can do to keep that water again in contact with native plants, the better. Native plants aren't just for beautiful landscaping in our yard or for natural areas. Bring natural areas into your yard. We need to create these systems in our communities. Yes, absolutely. Make a rain garden, please.
Deborah asks, if you have to reduce the height of plants for access to the lake and sight views, what would be the lowest you would cut them back annually?
Good question. Great question. I love that question. On the landscape, I see people, especially Spartina, and that's this grass here. I see landscapers take ornamental grasses and cut them back every year. And the idea on that is you're mimicking fire and you're getting rid of thatch. However, when those are cut back to 6 inches or so, you're actually creating more thatch because that new growth has to grow up through those dead 6 inches of plants. Yes, you get a green, beautiful plant, but again, we leave ours just natural and let them grow like they would in an ecosystem. Sometimes we need to do just that. We have an annual Father's Day um, event, a fishing event, and we actually will cut the grasses down. And what we do is we'll cut them down to 3 to 6 inches. And we'll take when you do that, remember that you open up, think about ecological function. You're opening up light gaps, and those are opportunities for weeds to come in. We don't want to spend our time treating weeds. We want to spend our time, creating ecosystems. So when we cut those grasses, we lay them down um, parallel to the shoreline, or lay them down so that they on the banks, on the upper part of the banks, as mulch. Don't remove them. That's organic matter that will go back into the soil. It takes a while for those fibers to break down. So you're not adding organic matter to the water to decompose. So if you do need to do this, the other thing that we do in some of our key areas that in rotation, we'll cut about a third of the plants at a time rather than the entire bank, and just randomly cut some of those grasses down. 3 to 6 inches is all right. You want to get rid of that thatch though when you're doing that. So yeah, great question.
Have you approached the Florida Department of Transportation to use native plants in all of their stormwater systems?
That's a fantastic question. There is a current project that a landscape architecture firm is doing as a kind of a trial project. And I have worked with them a little bit um, on some of these concepts and ideas. I always fear that someone will follow a plant list. And again, that's my problem with plant lists. Well, someone will follow a plant list that has just those attractive, pretty plants, native plants that aren't going to provide full coverage or ecosystem function. So we want to see these work. So I'm hoping that project, and they're collaborating with DOT, I'm hoping that project can become a model. We have had folks from several different agencies come out. That's a great question, though. We should have DOT come out to the Botanical Garden, some representatives, and see our stormwater system. We work really closely with our water management district on ours to they promote what we're doing. They think it's great. So yeah, thank you. That's something I need to do. Reach out to the DOT. Thank you.
Do you ever give tours to FNPS chapters of the native plantings and pond landscape construction at the Naples Botanical Garden?
Absolutely. If when we get past all of this coronavirus and quarantining, the garden is opening up very soon. Right now, we're only open to members, but absolutely. As I said, this is one of our most popular tours. It's amazing how many people throughout the year request this tour, and we like to do it with groups. We've had HOAs come out. Again, the Blue Green Algae Task Force scientists have come out and done this, the water management districts, just homeowners in a community. So yes, absolutely. And I no longer go out to individual homeowners and offer recommendations. We've tried to do this. We found that that doesn't work as well. There's always okay, what's the next step? So we're doing this on a broader scale to impact community association managers, community boards, landscapers, aquatic areas managers, the pond managers. We're trying to do it more from that aspect, but we do offer this tour at the garden. So yes, please come down. And we have a lot of great native plants throughout our ecosystems at the garden. So it's not only a chance to see this, but yes, please come down and see all of our native plants.
Dusty was thinking milkweed would be another good littoral plant. Are there plants that you can think of that have high wildlife value to be used intermittently?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Milkweed, and this is where you get into the fun. Get that ecosystem function going. Get that broad coverage, that outcompeting the weeds. This is a high functioning system. It's holding the soil in. It's providing habitat for fish, for aquatic macroinvertebrates. But once you get that in, start playing. Once you get it established and you're successful, milkweed would be a great one to get in there. We have a plant down here in South Florida, Sarcostemma. It's related to milkweed. It's a pollinator plant. It's not as attractive, but it's kind of a vining, scrambling plant that would cover some of these areas. But I would plant that in here, some of our littorals. Yes, biodiversity, 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 and most of us in this conversation right now in this room are plant geeks. So get it established. I would not, milkweed won't cover a bank, but plant an area with lower grasses so that you can get some of those milkweeds that like wet feet in there. So yeah, absolutely. There's hundreds of plant species across the state that are native that could be incorporated into your stormwater system or a rainwater garden.
And Brian would like you to comment on landscaping for detention ponds.
Okay. Um, so stormwater ponds there's a lot of different stormwater pond designs. Some are meant to hold water for 24 hours. There's detention and retention. Uh, are you, so I see a lot of these grass bowl areas that are just turf. I would like to see more of those planted with just native grasses. That gives a cue to the landscapers to A, not mow, B, it provides habitat and cover for wildlife. But C, it's kind of that mentally, okay, um, let's not spray irrigation into this. It's not turf grass. And then let's not fertilize these. So for open bodies of water, I would do just as I mentioned. But for areas where where it's just inundated for brief periods of time, I would plant some of these grasses, and I would plant trees there to get some structure. Those areas need to be designed with these plants in mind because they do take up water holding storage capacity. So it's good to have them designed. They're designed to hold a specific capacity of water. So new designs, this is where we want to impact landscape architects in this to get more of this plant diversity out there. I hope that addressed the question.
Sandy asks, do you recommend or have a visual to present to our community association to help people see what a difference littoral plants can make?
So as we're doing this, we've really started establishing this class with our Collier County Pollution Control and with Rookery Bay. We've started really finding out, we've asked a lot of questions of every audience that's involved, all of the stakeholders. And you've really pointed out one of the key issues that we found is how do I go advocate to my community? How do I show visuals? So we're actually looking at the Botanical Garden at creating a short series of videos that you can share with your board and your community. Again, we don't want to do this where we're going out individually. We want to create a series of resources that you can use. So keep an eye out for that out of Naples Botanical Garden. We're working towards resources that you can use to take short videos that you can take to your landscape manager or your pond manager, your community association manager to help promote this idea of using native plants for clean water.
I've just dropped the Naples Botanical Garden YouTube channel link in the
Awesome.
chat so that people can follow that and be updated
Awesome.
when that comes along.
Thank you.
The Villages chapter asks, what do you plant with the Muhlenbergia? It seems like the Fakahatchee would overwhelm the Muhlenbergia.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So when we plant I like to put the Muhlenbergia. That's the. Let me go back. Well, we've got control over the images. So pink muhly grass, beautiful grass. I like to mix that in with the Spartina grass. The pink muhly grass, the leaves get kind of just, it's not as attractive as an ornamental grass other than when it's in bloom and then it's spectacular. So I like to mix it in with the sand cord grass. I like to mix it in with the dwarf Fakahatchee grass, but you're absolutely right. The Fakahatchee grass, this can get quite large, so it would swallow the muhly grass. Dwarf Fakahatchee grass is much smaller, so plant these, space them out so that they provide enough cover that you don't get weeds growing between them, but space them enough that, if you plant muhly grass in between those, put those in there at about 20%, as I mentioned. So go for your lower grasses if you're putting pink muley in. I would not plant it, as you say, with Fakahatchee grass. One of my favorite native plant names is, I love this. Fakahatchee grass is Tripsicum dactyloides. Dwarf Fakahatchee grass is Tripsicum floridanum. The other name that I hear for this is half-a-hatchee grass because it grows to about half the size of Fakahatchee grass. I love that as a native plant name. So, yeah, good point.
So Bill Klein, who's in Titusville, states, I would like information about building native plant shoreline project in a county park, chain of lakes, that supports water birds. Can you help me?
Um, my best recommendation, and as I mentioned, the thousands of stormwater ponds in Collier County, we started out, I was going to places to do this, and it became overwhelming. I found myself every evening and every weekend in a different community doing this. So we're trying to approach this from a bigger picture way. I highly recommend um, joining our classes through Rookery Bay. Watching for our videos. If you're doing this on a scale where you're impacting, lots and lots of ponds, please reach out to me by email, and I can think about ways that we can help. Um, Naples Botanical Garden is involved in the Caribbean. As I mentioned, we've got some colleagues joining us today from Cuba and Puerto Rico. We do a lot of work in the Bahamas. We work with about 90 botanical gardens across the Caribbean, and that really takes up a lot of our resources with plants. Um, I see that region. I see native South Florida native plants in the Caribbean. There's a lot of overlap, so we get stretched really thin. So unfortunately, I can't go out to every community and do this. But please reach out to me, and I'll look for ways that we can help. Um, First thing I would say is come visit the botanical garden. Bring your community down. Look at what we've done. The best way to sell this is to see it in person. So,
Barbara asks, do you have a document that mirrors the information in this presentation that can be shared with HOAs or even with city or county governments as a way to kick off an introduction to this concept?
right now, we don't. Again, we're just in that transition between um, me going out to all the communities and doing this individually, personally, and transitioning to coming up with a comprehensive education program that um, that that really hits every audience, because there are so many audiences involved. Again, that's that collaboration. So again, uh, watch closely, and we're working towards that. And we've realized that just a plant list is not enough. It's got to go to the concepts. It's got to go to everything. Everybody's got to be involved to make this happen out there. So, yeah, my apologies. I really wish when we started doing this, we had no idea how big it could be. And again, fantastic opportunity for native plants. And hopefully, this conversation today has expanded your view of native plants, that it's not just landscaping or native ecosystems. It's stormwater, it's ecosystem function in our communities. It's everywhere around us.
So I'm going to field these last two questions, then we're going to
Okay.
wrap it up.
All right.
Barbara also asks, can this concept also be implemented along the banks of man-made freshwater canals? If so, is there any concern with the vegetation interfering with water flow?
That's something that we're having a conversation with our water management district here about ways. Currently, some of our canals in our region are grass, and they're planted in grass like turf grass, and they need to be mown 4 times a year. And that's A, a lot of work, and B, that grass clippings are eventually going into the canals. So we are hoping to work with our water management district to trial something. Again, I recommend, there are hundreds of miles of canals in Florida. And again, just like on stormwater ponds in your community, all of them have different water quality, different flow rates, different elevations. So I encourage you to start small with trials, But yes, absolutely, this is something that could be done along canals. So reach out to your water management district. Look for a way to do this along canals, to plant plants that do all of the function that I've talked about today. On those canals, though, you can't really do the you do the upland buffers and not the plants, the literals going on down into the water because you can't impede the flow. But yes, absolutely, I would look at just those banks.
And Beth asked about recommended resources for making a rain garden. So I posted some IFAS documents, but if you have anything to add.
IFAS is a great resource. Every county is going to be different. Our Collier County Pollution Control is fantastic. They have great resources. They'll actually, we don't think about pollution control as a resource for rain gardens, but they are. They'll come out to your site and look at your site and make recommendations. We've worked with them to promote doing this in an ecological way. They're not native plant specialists. We've worked with them to look at our plant lists to help create these as ecosystems. Um, Botanical gardens are quite often a great resource, master gardener programs. Native Plant Society. I would love to see Native Plant Society chapters work towards this in your communities. Maybe this is something that you can take back to your chapter and and look at promoting. It's another great way. It's a vacuum that needs filled for native plants. And there's, as I said, there's thousands and thousands of linear miles of shoreline across the state that could use this.
Yeah, it would be great to get this expanded. You know, every retention pond, every stormwater pond, every canal having,
Yeah.
high quality native vegetation. I mean, the ecosystem services would be insane.
Absolutely, and it would also reduce the amount of work that goes into mowing and sometimes irrigating and the accidental fertilizing. All the way around, it's a beneficial thing. So absolutely,
Thank you so much for joining us today, Chad.
thank you everybody for joining us, and good luck.